The distress signal wasn't meant for us. They wanted the Galactic Council, elegant saviors in shining ships. Instead, they got humanity. We came from a death world in ships built like iron bricks, wielding weapons that made the void bleed. They asked for angels. They got the monsters. Elias gripped the edge of the central console, his knuckles bone white. The translation matrix embedded in his auditory cortex hummed, attempting to convert the deafening screech of tearing metal into a language his brain could process. It failed. The sound of a ship being eaten alive was universal. The sungrazer was dying. It was never built for war. His people hadn't fought a war in 10,000 years. The vessel was a colony ship, a beautiful, fragile spindle of spun glass and lattice alloy, designed to catch solar winds and glide between the stars. Deep in its belly, 3 million of his kind slept in cryostasis, dreaming of a new dawn on a virgin world. Instead, they had woken up to a nightmare. The swarm had found them in the dead space between sectors. They didn't hail. They didn't demand cargo or slaves. They simply descended like a cloud of mechanical locusts, all jagged edges and cold blue plasma cutters. "Hull integrity at 18%, Simon shouted over the klaxons. Simon was the ship's chief navigator, though the translation software gave him a blunt, familiar, human-sounding designation. Right now, he was a dead man, calculating the exact second of his own demise. "They've breached decks 4 through 9. Automated defense grids are offline. We're venting atmosphere in the lower habitation rings. Seal the bulkheads," Elias ordered, his voice remarkably steady for a man whose heart was currently beating fast enough to crack his ribs. "Divert all remaining auxiliary power to the structural integrity fields." It's not enough. They're chewing through the primary pylons. Elias looked at the primary viewing screen. The void of space was obscured by a writhing mass of jagged, dark shapes. They clamped onto the elegant curves of the sungrazer, boring into the hull with terrifying efficiency. Every few seconds, a muffled explosion vibrated through the deck plates, signaling another compartment lost to the vacuum. "Did the distress buoy launch?" Elias asked. Simon nodded, his large, dark eyes devoid of hope. 10 minutes ago. Broadband burst. Maximum range. But, Captain, we are deep in the outer fringe. The nearest galactic core fleet is 3 standard weeks away. No one is coming. Elias knew it. The core worlds didn't patrol this far out. Their elegant, pearl-white cruisers stayed close to the established transit lanes, guarding the civilized systems. Out here, in the cold dark, you were on your own. "Keep broadcasting," Elias said quietly. "Let the universe know we were here, at least." A massive shudder rocked the bridge. Sparks showered from the overhead conduits, raining down on the terrified crew. The main lighting died, instantly replaced by the sickly crimson glare of the emergency backups. On the monitor, a structural schematic of the ship flashed red. The central spine was failing. Elias closed his eyes. He thought of the 3 million dreamers below. He thought of his own family, curled in their frost-covered pods, waiting for a tomorrow that would never arrive. "I failed you," he thought. "Captain!" Simon's voice cracked. It wasn't a shout of fear. It was sheer, unadulterated shock. "I'm detecting a spatial rupture. Portside. Dangerously close." Elias snapped his eyes open. "The swarm? No, it's too massive. The energy signature it's completely wrong." Simon's hands flew across his console. "It's not a warp fold. It's not a slipstream glide. Captain, something is tearing a hole in space-time." Elias looked at the view screen, just in time to see reality rip open. When the galactic core ships arrived, they slid into normal space, like a knife through water. accompanied by a soft flash of azure light. It was a civilized method of travel. This was a violation. Space didn't part. It shattered. A violent, blinding tear of violet and raw white energy ripped across the void, spewing exotic radiation that made the Sungrazer's sensors scream. From the center of that swirling cosmic wound, a ship emerged. Elias stared. It was the ugliest vessel he had ever seen. There were no sweeping curves, no artistic flourishes or glowing solar sails. It was a brutal, asymmetric slab of dark gray metal, scarred by micrometeorites and previous battles. It looked like a brick of solid iron, bristling with communication spires and massive, ugly gun batteries. Along its flank, painted in harsh white block letters, was a word the translation matrix struggled to pass before settling on: UNSC Goliath. "Core Fleet," Simon whispered, trembling. "No," Elias breathed. "That isn't a core ship. It looks like a weapon." The swarm noticed the newcomer. Thousands of the mechanical parasites detached from the dying colony ship, swiveling their sensor arrays towards the massive grey intruder. Like a school of predatory fish, they changed course, surging toward the Goliath in a dense, dark cloud. Elias felt a pang of profound pity. Whoever had answered their call had just walked into a slaughterhouse. "They're hailing us," Simon said, shock still overriding his panic. "Audio only." "Put it through." The bridge speakers crackled with static, followed by a voice. It wasn't the melodic, synthesized chime of a core diplomat. It was rough, deep, and heavy, with an unmistakable undercurrent of gravel and exhaustion. "Unknown vessel. This is Captain David Hayes of the United Nations Space Command Dreadnought Goliath. We received your SOS. Looks like you've got a bit of a pest problem." A pause. In the background, Elias could hear the distinct sound of heavy machinery cycling and someone shouting orders. "Hold on to your teeth," the voice continued. "We're going to clear the board." David Hayes took a slow sip of coffee from a battered ceramic mug. It tasted like burnt copper and recycled water, exactly the way he liked it. He sat in the center seat of the Goliath's bridge, his scarred hands resting lightly on the armrests. The bridge was a cramped, utilitarian space. No holograms, no plush seating, no panoramic windows. Windows were structural weaknesses. They relied on heavily armored sensor arrays, feeding data to thick, shatterproof screens. The air smelled of ozone, old sweat, and machine oil. "Contact in 3 seconds, Captain," Leo Ramirez, the helmsman, called out from the forward pit. Ramirez was young, but his eyes were hard. He'd survived the siege of Sirius. He knew how to fly a brick through a meat grinder. "Bring us in close, Leo. Put us right between the hostiles and that civilian ship," Hayes ordered. The Goliath shuddered as the massive fusion engines flared, pushing 3 million tons of depleted uranium armor and weaponry forward. On the main tactical screen, the tactical situation was a mess. The alien ship, designated Unknown Alpha, was a glass toy being dismantled by a swarm of what looked like mechanical ticks. "Comms, did they copy my transmission?" Hayes asked, without looking away from the screen. Sarah Jenkins, the comms officer, pressed a hand to her earpiece. "Confirmed, Captain. They're broadcasting on a rudimentary binary channel, but the translation software caught it. They're taking heavy structural damage. Civilian colony vessel. Millions aboard in stasis." Hayes felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his gut. Colony ships. Families. People sleeping in the dark, helpless. Humanity knew a thing or two about being helpless in the dark. They had learned the hard way that the universe wasn't a friendly neighborhood. It was a dark forest, and there were wolves in the trees. Humanity hadn't hidden. They had simply decided to become a bigger, meaner wolf. "They're turning on us, sir," Ramirez said. On the screen, a massive cloud of the drones detached from the colony ship and rushed the Goliath. "Let them come," Hayes said softly. He hit the ship-wide intercom. "All hands, this is the captain. Brace for kinetic impact. Weapons control, spin up the main batteries. Give them the good stuff." "Main batteries online," Wyatt Ford, the chief engineer, growled over the comms from deep in the bowels of the ship. "Magnetic accelerator cannons 1 through 4 are hot and hungry. The swarm hit them. It wasn't a barrage of elegant energy weapons. It was a physical assault. Thousands of the drones slammed into the Goliath's hull, their plasma cutters flaring blue as they tried to bite through the ship's skin. The noise on the bridge was deafening, a horrific chorus of grinding metal and screeching alloys. The ship vibrated violently, rattling Hayes's teeth in his skull. "Shields are dropping!" Jenkins yelled over the noise. "Wait, they aren't bypassing the shields. They're physically anchoring to the hull plating." "They're trying to eat us," Ramirez said, his hands dancing across the helm controls to keep the massive dreadnought steady. Hayes took another sip of his coffee. The cup trembled in his hand, but his face remained a mask of calm. Core fleets relied on deflector shields and delicate energy grids. When those failed, they died. Humans didn't trust shields. Shields could be disrupted. Shields failed when the power went out. Humans trusted 3 meters of layered, depleted uranium and reinforced titanium A plating. "They're cutting into the outer armor layer," Jenkins reported. "Armor integrity at 98%. Hayes almost smiled. 98%. These little bastards were going to break their teeth trying to chew through a human dreadnought. "Enough foreplay," Hayes said. "Ford, give me a flak screen. Point defense network. Fire at will. Clear our hull." Along the vast, scarred flanks of the Goliath, hundreds of armored hatches snapped open. Automated rotary cannons deployed, tracking the swarming drones. They didn't fire lasers. Lasers lost cohesion over distance. Lasers generated heat. The Goliath fired depleted uranium slugs at 10,000 rounds a minute. Space around the human ship instantly filled with a blinding storm of tracer fire. It was a solid wall of kinetic death. The void outside silently erupted as hundreds of the swarm drones were shredded into scrap metal, their delicate plasma cutters and fragile armor no match for the brutal, primitive force of high-velocity lead and tungsten. The swarm visibly recoiled. It was a machine intelligence, but even machines understood mathematics. The math of attacking the Goliath was suddenly heavily weighted toward their own destruction. "They're pulling back from our hull," Ramirez reported. "Regrouping at Grid 09er. They're forming up for a concentrated run." "They're leaving the colony ship alone?" Hayes asked. "Affirmative. We have their undivided attention." "Good." Hayes set his mug down into the magnetic holder on his armrest. "Ford, the main guns." "Guns spun up to maximum yield, Captain," Ford confirmed. "Targeting solutions locked. Fire." Deep inside the Goliath, massive magnetic coils pulsed. 4 solid tungsten projectiles, each the size of a city bus, were accelerated down the barrels spanning the length of the ship. They exited the muzzles at a fraction of the speed of light. There was no sound in space. But on the bridge, the recoil felt like a localized earthquake. The tungsten slugs crossed the distance in a millisecond. They hit the densest cluster of the swarm. The kinetic energy transferred into the hostiles was unimaginable. It wasn't an explosion. It was an erasure. The slugs tore through the drones, generating a localized shockwave of superheated plasma from the sheer friction of impact. A massive chunk of the swarm simply ceased to exist, vaporized into a rapidly expanding cloud of glowing dust. Silence fell over the bridge of the Goliath, save for the low hum of the fusion reactors and the clicking of cooling ventilation fans. Hayes looked at the tactical screen. The remaining drones, maybe a third of the original swarm, had frozen. They hung in the void for 3 seconds, processing the sheer, apocalyptic violence of what had just occurred. Then they broke. The swarm scattered, their drives flaring as they scrambled away into the deep dark, fleeing the monster that had just stepped out of the slipspace tear. "Hostiles are retreating," Ramirez said, letting out a breath he sounded like he'd been holding for a week. "They are leaving the sector." Hayes didn't cheer. He didn't relax. He just picked up his coffee again. It was cold now. Stand down from red alert, but keep the point defenses hot," Hayes ordered. "Jenkins, get the captain of that glass spindle back on the horn. Let's see what we just saved." A moment later, the screen shifted. The tactical map was replaced by a visual feed from the sun grazer. Hayes looked at the alien captain. He was a fragile-looking creature, tall and impossibly thin, with pale skin that seemed to catch the harsh emergency lighting of his own bridge. His large, dark eyes were wide, staring through the screen at Hayes with an expression that crossed borders and species. It was pure, unadulterated awe, mixed with abject terror. "This is Captain Hayes of the Goliath," Hayes said, his voice flat but not unkind. "Looks like they decided to find an easier meal. What's your status over there?" Elias stared at the grizzled, scarred biped on the screen. The human wore a faded fabric uniform, smelled faintly of toxins, and sat in a chair that looked like it belonged in a factory. Yet, this creature had just annihilated a threat that would have consumed a core world. Elias's voice trembled through the translator. "I am Captain Elias. We are alive. 'Cause of you." He swallowed hard. What are you? The Galactic Council Registry has no record of a species utilizing such barbaric weaponry." Hayes chuckled, a low, raspy sound. "We're not on the Council, Elias. We applied once. They told us our world was a Class 5 Deathworld. Said we were too aggressive, too unrefined to sit at the big table." Hayes leaned forward, the harsh bridge lighting catching the scars on his cheek. "But when the wolves come to the door, nobody calls the diplomats. They call the guy with the shotgun." Hayes leaned back. "Hold your position, Sungrazer. We're sending over engineering teams and medical supplies. You're safe now." Elias slumped in his chair, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. He looked out the viewing port, past the floating wreckage of the swarm, at the brutal, ugly iron brick hovering in the dark. It wasn't an angel, it was a monster. But for the first time in his life, Elias thanked the stars that the monsters were on his side. The airlock cycled with a heavy, mechanical groan that sounded profoundly out of place aboard the Sungrazer. Elias stood in the central receiving bay, flanked by 2 of his surviving security officers. They held their delicate thermal lances nervously. The human boarding craft had locked onto their ruined hull with magnetic clamps that bruised the ship's elegant latticework. The heavy doors slid apart. The beings that stepped through were not giants, but they moved with a dense, terrifying gravity. They wore bulky, pressurized hazard suits, scraped bare of paint at the joints. They carried heavy crates of gear, plasma torches, and medical kits, slung over their shoulders like sacks of grain. At the head of the pack was a woman with graying hair tied back in a brutal knot. She didn't wear a helmet, trusting the Sungrazer's atmospheric readout. She wiped a smudge of grease from her cheek, revealing tired, pale skin, and looked around the crystalline bay. "I'm Commander Rachel Bowman, Chief Damage Control, UNSC Goliath," she said. Her voice carried no diplomatic warmth, just the blunt efficiency of someone who had a job to do. "Where's your failing spine?" Elias stepped forward, willing his knees not to buckle. "I am Captain Elias. The central structural pylons are on deck 4. But Commander," Our alloy is a microcrystalline lattice. It requires precise acoustic resonance to repair." Bowman snorted. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Captain, your ship is bleeding out. We don't have time for the symphony. We're going to slap 3 inches of rolled titanium over the breaches and fusion weld it to your bulkheads. It's going to be ugly, but it will keep your people breathing." She turned to the squad of heavy-set engineers behind her. "Fort, get the stabilizing jacks down to the cryo decks. If those pods lose power, we're going to have 3 million popsicles on our conscience. Move." The humans dispersed like a blunt force trauma unit. They were loud. They shouted over each other, cursing in a harsh, guttural language when things slipped or sparked. They smelled of ozone, acrid sweat, and machine oil, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed air of the sun grazer. Elias followed a medical team down to the triage center. Here, the reality of the swarm's attack was laid bare. Hundreds of his crew were lined up on hovering pallets, suffering from decompression burns, shrapnel wounds, and the sheer physiological shock of violence. The Sungrazer's medical staff were overwhelmed, moving in a panicked, disorganized daze. A tall human male with a scruffy beard and bloodshot eyes pushed past Elias. His name tag read, Dr. Gregory Lang. Lang didn't ask for permission. He walked straight to a young navigator whose chest had been pierced by a shard of hull plating. The alien medic standing over her was waving a diagnostic wand, weeping softly as the girl's vital signs plummeted. "Move!" Lang barked, physically shoving the alien medic aside. He didn't use a diagnostic wand. He ripped his gloves off, ignoring standard sterilization protocols, and jammed his bare hands into the wound, clamping down on the ruptured blue artery. The alien girl screamed. I know, it hurts like hell," Lang said, his voice suddenly dropping its gruff edge, replaced by a low, rhythmic cadence. "Keep screaming, kid. If you're screaming, you're breathing. Hand me that biofoam canister, the red one, now." An alien nurse, terrified by the sheer aggression of the human, fumbled and dropped the canister. Lang didn't yell. He didn't even blink. He just reached out with his blood-soaked boot, kicked the canister up into his free hand, and jammed the nozzle into the wound. The foam expanded instantly, sealing the artery and stabilizing the pressure. The girl passed out, but the piercing alarm on her monitor quieted to a steady, rhythmic chime. Lang wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a streak of blue alien blood on his skin. He looked at the terrified medical staff. "Listen to me," Lang said, his voice carrying across the chaotic room. "You are looking at the math. And the math says you are going to lose these people. Stop looking at the math. Look at the patient. You don't let them die until I say they can die. Do you understand me?" They stared at him. I said, "Do you understand me?" Lang roared. "Yes," the head medic whispered. "Good. Now get me a surgical laser and 30 units of synthetic plasma. We have a long night ahead of us." Elias watched in stunned silence. His people were artists, philosophers, and diplomats. When faced with the inevitable, they accepted it with grace. They believed in the gentle cycle of the cosmos. These humans did not accept the inevitable. They fought it. They raged against the dying of the light with a vulgar, beautiful ferocity. They treated death not as a natural phase of existence, but as a personal insult. Hours bled into standard cycles. The humans didn't stop. They didn't sleep. They drank a foul-smelling brown liquid from insulated flasks and kept working. Elias walked the corridors of his ship. The pristine, elegant halls were now marred by human intervention. Massive slabs of dark grey titanium were bolted over the hull breaches, welded with aggressive, overlapping seams. Thick black power cables snaked across the glass floors, bypassing ruined circuitry to feed life support directly from portable fusion generators. It was a desecration of the ship's original design. It was ugly, and it was holding. Elias found Commander Bowman in the cryo bay, surrounded by the towering stasis pods. She was sitting on an overturned supply crate, eating a block of compressed protein with a 1,000-yard stare. "Commander," Elias said softly. Bowman looked up. "Captain, the structural integrity field is stable. We bypassed your main spine. You won't be setting any speed records, but you won't snap in half either. Cryopods are drawing directly from our ship's grid. I do not know how to repay this debt," Elias said, looking at the sleeping faces of his people behind the frost-covered glass. Bowman chewed slowly, swallowed, and stood up. "You don't. We don't do this for a paycheck, Captain." "But why?" Elias asked, the question that had been burning in his chest finally spilling out. "Your species applied to the Galactic Council. We rejected you. We labeled you dangerous. We called you a Deathworld." Bowman offered a grim, humorless smile. "You were right. Earth is a death world. Everything on it evolved to kill everything else. Storms, predators, tectonic plates, plagues. We spent our entire history fighting just to wake up the next morning. We are dangerous." She walked over to a cryopod, resting a gloved hand on the glass. "But because we come from the dark, we know exactly how cold it gets," Bowman said softly. "The core worlds, they've had peace for thousands of years. They sit in their shiny towers and debate philosophy. They don't know what it's like to be hunted. We do. Humanity made a promise when we finally broke out of our gravity well. We promised we wouldn't let the dark take anyone else if we could help it." She turned back to Elias, her eyes hard as iron. "We are the monsters, Captain. But we're the monsters that keep the other monsters under the bed." The Goliath didn't detach. Instead, the dreadnought fired massive, physical grapnels, locking its scarred iron hull to the fragile lattice of the sun grazer. It was a ridiculous pairing. A bruised brick towing a shattered glass ornament through the dark. For 2 standard weeks, they limped toward the core. The swarm didn't return. Machines understood math, and the math of engaging the Goliath always resulted in 0. When they finally crossed the threshold into council space, the void flashed. 3 core cruisers slipped out of a slipstream glide, their pearl-white hulls and azure sails glowing perfectly against the backdrop of the stars. They were pristine. They looked like gods. "Unknown military vessel," a synthesized melodic voice chimed over the comms. "This is Fleet Admiral Vial of the Galactic Corps. You are violating Council space. Detach your tethers and power down your weapon grids immediately, or we will fire." On the bridge of the Goliath, Captain Hayes didn't flinch. He just set his mug down. "Open a video channel," Hayes ordered. "Main screen." Hayes stared into the camera. He looked like hell. His uniform was stained with engine grease, his eyes bagged from 2 weeks of stim caf and 0 sleep. "Admiral Vale, this is the UNSC Goliath," Hayes growled. "We just dragged this civilian ship through a swarm feeding frenzy because your shiny fleet was too busy patrolling the safe zones to do its job. The Sungrazer has 3 million people in cryo hanging by a thread. So you are going to lower your guns, send over your best medical tenders, and do exactly what I say until they are secure." Silence stretched across the void. Nobody spoke to the core fleet like that. "And if we refuse?" Vial asked, his melodic tone hardening. Hayes leaned forward, the bridge lighting casting long shadows over his scars. "Then you'll find out exactly why they call us a death world." The core cruisers didn't fire. Their sensors swept the Goliath, calculating the kinetic yield of its magnetic accelerator cannons and the sheer, absurd density of its depleted uranium armor. Slowly, the sleek weapon batteries on the white ships powered down. "Understood, Goliath," Vael conceded, dispatching rescue tenders. Hayes cut the main feed and opened a private line to the Sun Grazer. "All right, Elias. Your shiny knights are here. We're cutting you loose." Elias stood on his ruined bridge, panic flaring. "You are leaving. Captain, you must dock. The Council must recognize this. There will be honors." "We don't do well with politicians, Elias," Hayes said, a faint smirk cracking his tired face. "Just make sure you build your next ship with heavier armor. Space is cold." The explosive bolts fired. The Goliath drifted away. It didn't turn gracefully. It simply spun on its axis, pointed its blunt nose back into the uncharted dark, and tore a violent, blinding hole in space-time. As the angelic ships of the core finally surrounded the Sun Grazer in soft, healing light, Elias watched the scar in reality fade. The angels had arrived, but they were late. When the universe bared its teeth, it was the monsters who held the line. If you felt the adrenaline of the Goliath crashing into the void and loved seeing humanity show the galaxy what it really means to be a Deathworlder, smash that like button. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans who know that sometimes you don't need a diplomat, you need a dreadnought. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more epic HFY stories where humans prove we aren't just surviving the dark, we own it. Stay heavy, Earthlings.